What is up, y'all? Welcome back to Rough Drafts. My name is Sam Pratt, and this week we are going to be talking about Barrels of Blasting Jelly. Barrels of Blasting Jelly is a common in Avatar. It is 1 colorless mana. It's an artifact, has 1 tap, add 1 mana of any color, activate only once each turn, so you can mana filter. And it's also a removal spell. You can pay 5 mana, tap, sack it to deal 5 damage to target creature. I was really high on Barrels after preview season and in the first week of the format, but I've actually come down a decent amount on the card. I end up not playing it except in some specific scenarios. Now, those specific scenarios do come up fairly often, and I'm going to outline them in a second. But I do think that this card is pretty golden egg-ish. If you don't know golden egg, that's like the terminology that Lords of Limited use. It's kind of like an award they give to a card every set. The original Golden Egg was a card from Throne of Eldraine. It was like a cantripping artifact that fixed your mana and did like a lot of really important things to Throne of Eldraine decks. And that was a card that you would take speculatively pretty highly just because it was so likely to make your deck. It did a lot of things for a lot of different decks. I think Barrels is in the same general camp as Golden Egg. I think it is going to be their pick for Golden Egg of this set. And I do think that this card is worth playing and worth taking somewhat highly in certain scenarios, in certain color pairs. But there's a specific decision tree I have of, is my deck a Barrels deck? And I've ended up picking it a lot less highly than I did week 1. And my evaluation of the card has actually gone quite a bit down from week 1. It's still a card I play, but just not making most of my decks like it did week 1. And I'm not spending high picks on it as much. This card is just not good on its face. It has a bunch of roles that it can fill and does an okay job, a very medium job of filling those roles. And I think with play boosters, with the increased focus on higher rarity cards that perform their role just okay, the value of that type of card has decreased over time as it has become a lot more easier to hit playables, and common removal has gotten stronger, so the deal 5 is a lot less valuable. But there still are a lot of spots to play it, and I think this is an important card in the format for a lot of different decks, even if I think it's not a great card and you have to be a little more picky about where you play it. I think the value of Barrels is when it fills multiple roles for your deck. Like I said, it does a lot of little things kind of well. And I think you need to hit roughly 3 different things for it to actually perform well in your deck. But once it is covering a couple of your bases, I think it becomes actively good and a card that you want to spend a fairly high pick on. For this reason, I'm not really picking them up early speculatively in pack 1. That was something I was doing week 1 of the format, and I stopped doing that. But once you know you're in a deck that would want a Barrels, I'm taking it pretty highly because I think it is valuable that this fills multiple roles. So I've come up with a sort of system for how I evaluate if my deck wants a Barrels of Blasting Jelly. So I've picked out 5 different things that Barrels can do in your deck in this format. And I've come up with a system to sort of explain when I play it by assigning a point value to each of these roles. And I think you want 4 points for Barrels to make your deck. So this might be a little weird to do over audio. I'm going to do my best to explain it. If your deck needs fixing, if the fixing, the mana filtering that Barrels provides is valuable to your deck, that's the most important part of this card, in my opinion. That's 3 points. And remember, like I said, you want 4 points for Barrels to make your deck. So 3 points for fixing. 2 points if you need another removal spell. Maybe you're short on removal. Maybe you're a green deck and you didn't pick up enough Rocky Rebukes. 2 points for removal. And then 1 point each if you care about waterbending. This is a permanent that you could play on curve to waterbend for whatever reason. 1 point if you have a lot of firebending in your deck and not a lot of ways to spend the mana. This is something that you can dump 5 mana into at instant speed in combat. And sometimes your decks with a lot of firebending just need a little bit of extra way to spend firebending mana. And the last point, which is also 1 point like these other 2, is if your deck wants a permanent that can sacrifice itself. Just to recap, you want 4 points, 3 points if you want fixing, 2 points if you want another removal spell, and 1 point each if you care about waterbending, firebending, or sacrifice. This isn't an exact system, of course. I think this is just a good way to give an overview of how I'm evaluating this card, because I do think that the fixing is the most important part, but I'm not usually only playing it for fixing. The fixing in this set is actually pretty strong. You can get there without barrels plenty of times just with lands. But like if I need the extra fixing and I have a bunch of waterbending cards in my deck, barrels becomes a card that becomes actively good. One other reason you would play this card, which I'll just cover very quickly, I'm assigning 4 points to barrels if you have the card Toph, the first metal bender in your deck. This is a rare, it's the Naya Toph that can basically earthbend onto artifacts, which means if you can earthbend onto your barrels, you can tap, sack your barrel, and then it comes back into play and you can earthbend onto it again. Barrels is like the number one card you want if you have Toph, the first metal bender, and this has come up quite a bit for me, actually. I've played with this card a bunch. Barrels is really good with this card. So I'll go into each of the 5 different points of where you might want barrels. Like I said, by far the most important part of the card is the fact that it can fix your mana. Usually when people are talking about fixing in terms of valuing a card that can fix for you, they're talking about splashing a 3rd or 4th color. However, in this set, I actually think the fixing on barrels comes up a lot when you're trying to build around the monocolor payoffs. So say you're building around Rockalanche, which is the mono green payoff that earthbends equal to the number of forests you control. Say you're a green-red deck. I want like 10, 11 forests, like actual forests in my deck to play Rockalanche and be really happy with it. Obviously, you want as many as you can get, but like 10, 11 is getting to the point where I am happy with a Rockalanche in my deck. You can kind of count barrels in that scenario as most of a red source if you're in a green-red deck, which means if you're trying to build around barrels, you have more room to cut a mountain for another forest to hit that 10, 11 threshold. And while I'm usually not playing barrels if that's the only thing it's doing, oftentimes green decks can be short on just single target removal. So obviously the fixing and the removal is something that bumps barrels up in your pick order. Like I've had a couple near mono green decks that are using barrels as a form of fixing, so I can play 11 forests but still splash 1 or 2 other colors. I think that the other 3 relevant monocolor payoffs, so not the red one, I've played barrels with them also. Like Waterbending Scroll is the blue monocolor payoff. I've played barrels decks where I am like 10 islands and then I play a couple barrels to splash both black and red for interaction, and I'm playing like a blue control deck. Barrels is really good for being able to do that in that type of deck. I've had some splashy Cat Gator decks where I'm playing 10, 11 swamps and then splashing a couple of other colors for like bombs or something, or maybe like a Tolls of War. I just want to stress that usually when people are talking about fixing, they're talking about splashing a 3rd color, and I've actually used fixing in the other direction to try to get my deck more monocolor with barrels, and I think that's a big part of this card in the format. On the removal part, I want to stress that barrels is not good removal. It's bad removal. Like a 5-mana deal 5 is not a spell that you're putting in your deck, even at instant speed, and it also has the added downside of your opponent being able to see it coming. Like barrels is sitting on the battlefield for several turns. They can like play around it, either holding up a protection spell or maybe like sandbagging a more important thing that you'll have to deal with later. Most of your decks just need to hit like a removal threshold, and I found that especially if I'm like heavy blue or heavy green decks, sometimes I just really need any removal spell that can deal with something. But I do want to stress that you don't want to just play barrels just for removal. It's just like not good enough in 2025. The water bending aspect of barrels is pretty self-explanatory. It's just a permanent you can water bend. For fire bending, it seems like a little bit weird, like it's a clunky removal spell in like your aggro deck, but one point with aggressive decks is that it's often better for your removal in your aggressive decks to be more expensive, more catch-all. I heard it put like this: when you're playing a defensive deck, you want to spend your removal spells early and then play big things that can end the game later. In an aggressive deck, it's actually the opposite. You're trying to get on board early and then remove your opponent's blockers after you've already played your creatures. So I'm actually a lot more okay with playing a clunky removal spell in an aggressive deck than a defensive deck. And so barrels fits right in if you have a lot of firebending and you need like a big removal spell that can kill a 5 toughness creature. For things that care about sacrifice triggers, the only one below rare that you would care about is Tolls of War, the black-white signpost. But there are a couple rares that ask you for sacrifice triggers, and I think that Barrels plays a fairly important role in these decks if you just need more sacrifice triggers. So there's Obsessive Pursuit, which is the sort of like Phyrexian Arena variant that makes a clue every turn. There's Sandbender Scavengers, which is the black-white rare, which is like not a great card, but I have had some black-white decks that use it effectively, and Barrels being able to trigger Scavengers at instant speed has come up quite a bit. And then the mythic Phoenix Fleet airship that copies itself if you sacrificed can just be a little bit extra sacrifice fodder for the airship. Now that I've outlined where I actually like to play Barrels, I want to talk a little bit more about fixing in this set and multicolor more generally. I do have an episode from earlier this year, episode 15 from Final Fantasy Reach the Horizon, where I'm talking about different levels of fixing and mana base. I go pretty in depth on the different types of limited mana bases, like the different types of multicolor limited mana bases. So if you want like a general look at mana bases, I do have that episode for you. But just for Avatar specifically, I'm actually not splashing very much at all in this format. I was taking Barrels too highly week one and trying to splash a little too much. But I actually have come around to, I like kind of rarely splash in this format. The rares are very, very good in this format, and there are a lot of good rares, but it's very notable that the rares are almost all correctly double pipped. So something like Legend of Kuruk, which is the mythic green saga, or actually you can look at all of the mythic sagas. They're all double pipped, which means it's a lot more difficult to actually splash off-color rares in this format. Like the list of splashable rares that are worth splashing is like pretty small. And beyond that, I do think that this format is pretty balanced. Like the colors are balanced. I find that I can navigate into an open lane with a deck that I'm happy with in almost every single draft. I haven't really felt like I've needed to dip into a third color very often. And this also comes up in that I don't splash very much just because you can't splash very many rares in this format. I've talked in other formats about building these like multicolor piles where you get past a bunch of different gold rares. They're just like aren't that many splashable rares in this format. So these multicolor, like 4 or 5 color piles that I like to build just don't come together that often in this format. I have done it. It's just a little bit more rare because so many things are double pipped. I do like lighter splashes for removal spells in certain positions. I've mentioned I've had some like very heavy base blue decks, very heavy base green decks that have been splashing in 2 different directions. I think that's a place where I do really like Barrels, like I've said. And I do think in both green and blue, splashing for like cheap interaction like Firebending Lesson or even like a Sold Out if you just need more interaction is something that I'm pretty interested in doing. Like if you can be just blue or green all the way down and then just splash a couple of removal spells in a couple different colors, I think the mana in this format supports it pretty well, both with Barrels, also with Aang's Journey, which is a card I've played more than I thought I would. I don't love this card, but if you care about lessons, it's important. This is like the lesson kind of environmental sciences. You can search a basic and gain 2. If you're in the space where, especially in blue, and you're splashing multiple cheap removal spells of different colors, I think Rumble Arena is really strong in that spot. This is the land that has vigilance, and when it enters Scry 1, and then you can tap it for colorless, or it has that filter, the 1 tap, add 1 mana of any color. This sort of effect is a lot better at splashing cheap cards than it is expensive cards, making your Balmy 5-drop cost 6 is a lot worse than making your Firebending Lesson cost 2, and then you just cast it like on turn 4 with a 2-drop. On the topic of when I do splash rares, the other week, I actually looked at exactly which rares you're likely to splash. Like there's a list of like 12 or something because so many of the good rares in this format are double pipped. There's actually a really short list of rares that you are likely to splash. And I was looking at this because I wanted to know which dual lands were worth speculating on. Because with such a short list of cards worth splashing, I do think you can drill down into exactly what colors you might be looking to splash a rare in. So the notable thing that I found from looking at this list of rares was that almost all of Black's rares are splashable. If you go down the list, just like 17 lands, tier lists, look at the top performing cards, Almost all of the black bombs are double pipped. You have Rise of Sozin, Fire Nation Drill, Ko the Face Stealer, Phoenix Fleet Airship, Day of Black Sun. All of these cards are double pipped and not splashable unless you're doing something really pily. The one exception is Raven Eagle, but I think it's very notable that just black is not really worth splashing, picking up dual lands speculatively. I do think if I'm in blue, sometimes I will pick up the blue-black dual land or maybe a black dual land to try to splash Foggy Swamp Spirit Keeper, the blue-black uncommon. But in general, just black is not something worth speccing on dual lands for. Red does not have that many either. It's got Boomy Unleashed, which is a really good red-green mythic. There's also Wartime Protesters, which is like the red 4/4 haste, which can be fine to splash in like green-white decks sometimes. But there's like I said, there's really not that many red rares that you would want to splash. I do think the Bant colors have really good rares to splash. The Bant rare Aang is a big one. There's also the rare Azula, the blue-black Azula that has double black pip but single blue pip, and the rare Katara, which has double blue pip but single white pip. So the Bant... So anytime there's a really like poor pick in front of me and I can spec on a Bant dual land, maybe if I'm like in black, I spec on a black-white land if I'm in blue-black. That's something that I've done and I've got rewarded a couple times for that. It's just, I think, worth knowing that the Bant ones are way more valuable than the black or red ones. When you're building these multicolor piles, when it does come up, I will say that I am someone that does tend to splash a lot. Like I've said, I've not done it that much in this format, but building a pile, playing a bunch of colors does not mean you have to play a bad mana base. The fixing is actually really good in this format between the dual lands, barrels, Aang's Journey, stuff like Hermetic Herbalist in blue-green. There are plenty of ways to build a very reasonable mana base with 8 sources of your core colors at least. I'm very proud of my mana bases. That's something I take pride in my deck building and drafting, is that I very rarely, if ever, build bad mana bases. I think that it can be really important to have a single base color and have like 10 sources of that. And then you can maybe skimp on your secondary colors to help round your mana base out if you are splashing around. Like if I had like a black deck that's black-blue, plays a lot of black sources because I'm playing Cat Gator, and I think this black deck did splash Bant Aang. So there's a lot of ways you can stretch your mana base. I would refer back to my episode from Final Fantasy about mana bases. I think it was episode 15. I do think at some point I will start double splashing busted rares and mythics. I haven't needed to yet, but it is something to be aware of. I do think if you're heavy one color and lighter in 2 of your secondary colors, you do have a little more room to splash, double splash like these really good rares and mythics. I won't get into that right now. I do think that's worth thinking about for the future. I will do one word of caution. Please don't put Cycle of Renewal in your deck. This is the green card that's basically Harrow. It's a lesson. You sack a land, then search your library for 2 basics and put them onto the battlefield tapped. This is just everything you don't want to be doing in the format. Playing to the board is so important in this deck. You really want to be building a mid-range deck, even if you are splashing around. This card costing full 3 mana just puts you so far behind. I rarely, if ever, lose to this card, and I've never put it in a deck, and I would really recommend not. The uncommon one that's Rampant Growth, that one can be okay sometimes because it comes down on 2, or you double spell with it on 4, but a full 3 mana for your Rampant Fixing is just not worth it. I could see a world where you are double splashing a couple different rares. Like if you have like a Rise of Sozin and want to double splash it, cycle searching up 2 basics could be relevant there, but really just don't put this card in your deck. It's not what you want to be doing. I'm going to wrap it up there. I am releasing this a couple days early because I'm about to go on vacation. I have my episode next week already queued up. That's going to be a day later, so it doesn't fall on Christmas. And that is going to be an episode with a guest. You'll see who the guest is next week. And then I believe the week after that, I will be doing one more Avatar episode, probably like the grab bag / wrap up episode before we move on to Lorwyn. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social. I'm on Discord at samp6, and I stream at samp_mtg. Thanks for listening. See you next week.